Has Arnold Schwarzenegger heard any of your records? And I wonder what he thinks of it.
Well, what happens when a joke about killing predators and getting to the choppa stops being funny? What happens when the guy who built a career on faith-based lyrics gets arrested for trying to hire a hitman to murder his own wife? He was the frontman for one of the biggest bands in Christian metal, a Grammy-nominated artist who screamed about struggle and redemption. He was also the mastermind behind a side project that was a total tongue-in-cheek love letter to Arnold Schwarzenegger's most violent action movies. Then in May of 2013, the line between the joke and reality didn't just get blurry, it completely shattered. News broke that frontman Tim Lambesis, the Christian metal icon, had been arrested for trying to hire a hitman. All the goofy, fake violence from his music was suddenly staring back at him in the form of a real-life crime plot that was darker than any movie. So how did Tim Lambesis, the guy from a Christian metalcore band As I Lay Dying, and the creator of the parody project Austrian Death Machine, end up here? Before we get started, be sure to hit the bell notification icon and put all notifications on. I hear from a lot of my subscribers that they don't even get notifications when I post my videos. I would greatly appreciate if you guys did that. Back in the mid-2000s, As I Lay Dying were a cornerstone of the whole metalcore scene, selling a ton of records and touring everywhere. But they held a pretty unique spot in the world of aggressive music. They were one of the most prominent Christian metal bands on the planet. Their frontman Tim Lambesis was the face of the whole thing. He was intense, charismatic, and wrote these lyrics about faith and doubt that really connected with a huge fan base. But behind the super serious vibe of the band, Lambesis was working on something completely different, an idea that was fueled less by scripture and more by Stallone and, well, Schwarzenegger.
Well, Austrian Death Machine was sort of like a passing whim, this crazy idea that came up hanging out with my friends, just goofing around. And I sort of get a thrill out of everybody being like, oh, that would be so funny if you actually did that, but actually being the guy that pulls it off. I think that's hilarious, but not just talking about it, because a lot of people just talk about how there's big plans to do this, and I kind of let it flow under the radar, and then next thing you know, I had a whole album's worth of material out, and I think to me that was part of the fun, and also that the whole outlet of this just lighthearted side of my personality, because just naturally being an As I Lay Dying or being in a metal band in general, people just assume you're either a very angry person, or if your lyrics are a little bit more poetic, or they have something to say, that you're a very serious person, like.
In 2018, he unleashed it on the world, and it was called Austrian Death Machine. Austrian Death Machine was a side project, but it was also a kind of a mission statement for him. It was a loving and seriously heavy parody of 80s action movies, specifically the ones starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. Lambesis basically conceived it as a one-man project, writing and recording almost everything himself: guitars, bass, drums, and his own vocals. To make it complete, he brought in Chad Ackerman from the band Destroy the Runner to do spoken word parts impersonating Arnold himself. The concept was pretty simple and honestly kind of funny and brilliant. The song titles were just direct quotes from Schwarzenegger's movies.
Get to the chopper!
The music was just blistering, super fast thrash metal, all intentionally over the top. It was fun, it was nostalgic, and it was ridiculously violent on purpose. The first album, Total Brutal, came out in 2008, and it was an instant hit with metalheads who grew up on movies like Commando and The Terminator. You couldn't get a bigger contrast. On one hand, you have Lambesis, the thoughtful leader of As I Lay Dying. On the other, he's the guy behind a band that glorifies cartoonish Hollywood violence, even releasing an EP called A Very Brutal Christmas. He followed it up in 2009 with Double Brutal, and the whole project was seen as this harmless, hilarious outlet. Nobody could have guessed that this violent fantasy world he made up as a joke was about to get overshadowed by a horrifying reality he was creating himself. While fans were headbanging to Austrian Death Machine and singing along to As I Lay Dying, the foundation of Lambesis' life was starting to crack. That public image of the devout Christian frontman was becoming an empty shell. and inside a storm of ego, anger, and chemicals was brewing. One of the biggest issues was a major crisis of faith. In interviews he did years later, Lambesis would admit that he'd actually become an atheist long before his arrest. He didn't believe anymore, but kept on fronting one of the world's most popular Christian bands. He told himself it was just a business decision, a way to keep selling records to a Christian fan base he didn't even identify with anymore. He was living a lie, and that created a ton of cynicism and detachment from who he even was. At the time, his personal life was a mess. His marriage to his wife Megan was falling apart. The stress of being on the road all the time, mixed with his changing beliefs, just drove a wedge between them. Lambesis started to see his wife as an obstacle rather than a partner, and it was during this time that Lambesis got a new obsession: bodybuilding. On the surface, it just looked like a disciplined hobby, but it spiraled into something way darker. His drive to get more muscular led him to start using anabolic steroids, and the side effects from steroids are no joke, and they're well documented. They can cause aggression, paranoia, and just terrible judgment, what people often call roid rage. For Lambesis, this basically poured gasoline on the fire of his marriage problems and his crisis of faith. There's also a weird irony here. The very guy he was parodying in Austrian Death Machine, Arnold Schwarzenegger, is the most famous bodybuilder in the world. In a way, Lambesis was trying to become that hyper-masculine ideal his joke band celebrated. But where Arnold's characters on screen were heroes, Lambesis' real-life aggression was turning inward and destroying his life. He wasn't just the creator of a band about violent movies anymore. He was becoming the unstable anti-hero of his own dark story. By early 2013, Lambesis' twisted thinking had landed on one horrifying idea. He didn't want to be married anymore, and he was convinced a divorce would mean he'd lose access to the 3 children he and Megan had adopted. He decided he wanted his wife gone permanently. The man who wrote songs about redemption decided murder was, well, the answer. The plan started to form when Lambesis, in his steroid-fueled rage, went to a personal trainer at his gym and casually asked if the trainer knew anyone who could get rid of his wife. The trainer was understandably shocked and went straight to the police. So the San Diego County Sheriff's Department put together a sting operation. They got an undercover detective to pose as a hitman named Red, and on May 7, 2013, Lambesis met Red in a Barnes & Noble, a totally surreal place to plan a murder. The whole conversation was recorded, and Red was crystal clear, asking Lambesis straight up if he wanted his wife dead. Lambesis didn't hesitate. He confirmed it and handed the undercover cop an envelope. Inside it was $1,000 cash for a down payment, photos of his wife, her address, the security gate codes to her complex, and a list of dates when he would have the kids, giving the hitman a perfect window to the job and giving Lambesis the perfect alibi. The detective gave him one last out, asking just to be sure, "You want her gone?" To which Lambesis' response was chilling, "Yes, that's what I want." Right after the meeting, as Lambesis walked out of the bookstore, the police swarmed in and arrested him. The news went viral. Lambesis was arrested for solicitation of murder, and it was impossible to believe. Fans and musicians were just stunned. The line between the cartoon violence of Austrian Death Machine and a real-world murder plot had been crossed in the most shocking way. The parody was now over. Fallout from his arrest was pretty immediate. His bandmates and As I Lay Dying put out a statement saying how shocked and devastated they were, and the band pretty much dissolved. The whole metal scene was just left trying to figure out how the guy who they knew from the stage could be accused of something so awful. In court, the frontman's defense team tried to argue that his judgment was clouded by steroid use, the whole roid rage defense. But as the evidence started to pile up, especially those chilling audio recordings, that strategy quickly changed. Facing undeniable proof, Lambesis pleaded guilty to one count of felony solicitation of murder. And in May of 2014, exactly 1 year after his arrest, he was sentenced to 6 years in state prison. But in a bizarre twist that could only happen in this story, the music of Austrian Death Machine was still going. In the middle of all his legal problems, Lambesis had been working on a new album for the project. He used crowdfunding to finish it, and Triple Brutal was released in April of 2014, just a month before he was sentenced. The timing was just deeply unsettling. Here was a comedy album full of songs about fake violence, released by a guy about to go to prison for planning real violence. For some fans, it was a last creative act before he lost his freedom. For a lot of others, it was just grotesque. The humor of Austrian Death Machine just wasn't funny anymore. Lambesis was released on parole around December of 2016 after serving about 2.5 years in prison. He came out of prison publicly expressing remorse and trying to reestablish his career, which, as you can imagine, came with a ton of controversy. He actually reformed As I Lay Dying with the same members who were so devastated by his actions. The reception was, well, as you can imagine, deeply divided. Some fans were all about second chances and redemption. Others felt betrayed and argued that his crime was just too severe to be overlooked. For nearly a decade after that, Austrian Death Machine stayed quiet. Then in 2023, Lambesis announced that the project was back, releasing a new single titled No Pain, No Gain, and in February of 2024, a full album titled Quad Brutal. It was issued on well-known metal label Napalm Records. You're maybe wondering whether Schwarzenegger himself has ever heard the band, and here's what Lambesis has to say about that.
In the record. Now, I know that there's a fantasy part of this where you guys like to pretend like it is Arnold Schwarzenegger, but I got to ask you the question. Has Arnold Schwarzenegger heard any of your records? And I wonder what he thinks of it.
Well, I've heard rumors that Arnold has heard the record. This is what I've been told, is that one of the Austrian Death Machine fans has a brother that works works for the government, works at the governor's office up in Sacramento, and showed Arnold the CD, and Arnold thought it was hilarious, but he couldn't understand the words at all. Really? Which to me sounds like a very believable answer, although until I actually hear Arnold say something, I don't know if I'll believe it.
As for what the frontman thinks about his time as governor of California, he answered, "I'm not too keen on politics, so I don't keep up enough to critique his politics. I just think on a contextual level, it's funny to me that such a gnarly action guy would do such a serious job like running an entire state. I think he's done some things well and other things he could do better. I don't know the ins and outs of all his politics, although I know the ins and outs of all his movies." Now, I do want to point out there was a band that predated Austrian Death Machine called Arnocore that had a similar kind of angle when it came to the songs they performed.
They're not political, but they are loud. Welcome to the flexing hard rock world of Arnocore, a Bay Area-based band whose outfits and lyrics are all about Arnold.
We are the last action rock heroes. That's right.
But the 6 members of Arnocore, who have developed a following that shouts out lyrics to Schwarzenegger movies during concerts, insist they're not just a band on the bandwagon.
Arnold who?
These guys have been playing together for 3 years, long before this guy sought political office.
The man that you're talking about, his name was as stale as day-old strudel. That's right, when we started this band.
But with Austrian accents and a flair for the dramatic, Arnocore gives more than just a nod to its namesake. They're having fun with the whole thing, right down to the physical fitness. In San Francisco, Scott Budman, NBC 11 News.
However, the past has a way of catching up, and even before the new Austrian Death Machine album, the world Lambesis had rebuilt started to crumble once again. Around 2021 and 2022, controversy flared up as multiple members of As I Lay Dying left the group. Also, not long after, the members who were set to play in the live version of Austrian Death Machine also quit. The reason given publicly was an unhealthy environment and concerning patterns of behavior from Lambesis. One drummer, Brandon Short, who played on Quad Brutal, publicly stated that leaving was necessary for his own mental well-being. Things got even messier when videos reportedly showing volatile arguments between Lambesis and his new wife surfaced online, leading to a domestic violence investigation. Lambesis fired back, claiming the videos were manipulated and released after he had filed for divorce. Regardless of who you believe, the headlines were damaging all over again. The redemption story was being replaced by a narrative of instability, casting a dark cloud over everything. The story of Austrian Death Machine is now just impossible to separate from the story of Tim Lambesis. What started as a fun thrash metal joke is now forever linked to its creator's crimes. The fake violence of Get to the Choppa doesn't exist in a vacuum anymore. It's permanently in the shadow of a real-life murder plot. This whole case really forces fans to ask one of the hardest questions: can you separate the art from the artist? For some people, Quad Brutal is just a great thrash album, and for others, every guitar riff is tainted by what they know about Lambesis' past. The ongoing turmoil suggests the story is far from over, and it became a long, complicated saga about more than just music. It's about the collapse of a public image, the destructive power of ego, and the messy, difficult path forward towards accountability. Austrian Death Machine was made as a tribute to indestructible heroes, but its real story is a deeply human and cautionary tale about how easily a hero can become the villain. That brings us to the end of today's video, guys. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again on Rock Roll True Stories. Take care.